If you don't know, last week I wrote a kid's book. Well, I had an idea for a kid's book and I asked ChatGPT to make it for me. Spoiler alert, it did it, and it turned out super well. The prompt engineering to make it all happen was complicated, but the end result was well worth it. ChatGPT kept track of the narrative flow of the story. For each page of the book, ChatGPT wrote the text and also suggested an illustration to go with it. Not only that, but ChatGPT also generated the exact Midjourney commands for those illustrations so that I could paste them in and generate the art in 2 clicks. I promised you guys that in this video, I would take the time to evaluate the book we generated, give you a chance to see every image on every page, and of course, do a dramatic reading of the entire thing. But first, let's talk stats. Grammarly gives the book an 86, saying the book is engaging, that the delivery is just right, and that it is, quote, a bit unclear. We'll take a solid B. The Hemingway editor says it's written for grade 7. OpenAI's text classifier says it's likely AI generated. Yes, it is. If you don't know, my book was about George Washington and the story of his famed crossing of the Delaware River. It's what this painting is from. While preparing this video, I have read through this book probably a dozen times. It's good, but it's not perfect. I will say the thread of the story remains intact throughout the entire thing. By that, I mean the story was about George Washington the entire time. And it progressed relatively smoothly despite being generated in little chunks. But even though it was working from an outline, ChatGPT seemed to really love ending the story. After anything went well for our hero, George Washington, there was a tendency to overvalue the success and kind of wrap up the whole thing, especially towards the end. Also, if you remember, I asked for that book to be for a first grader, and this book is definitely for above a first grade level. But overall, I will say it was coherent, the images were impressive and on topic, especially since ChatGPT came up with the prompts for me, and I always just picked one of the 4 images Midjourney gave me for each page. And overall, being coherent is just a little bit scary. If you think about it, when I generated this book, I followed a simple, iterative framework, generating 1 page at a time based on pieces of an outline. ChatGPT was recently made available by API, which means it would only take a few days of development for someone to make a generator that took a book idea and turned it into a book with 1 click of a button. They could charge you credits and say for $5 you could have a personalized book on any topic you wanted. Between ChatGPT and APIs for DALL-E 2 or Stable Diffusion, it could generate both text and images with no trouble at all, just using the framework I did. Or instead of making it public, entire publishers could pop up with books that, instead of being written by an author and illustrated by an artist, the book was entirely AI generated. It could fill pages of Amazon search, or even start filling the shelves in real life of stores. It's way cheaper to get a computer to generate a book based on some popular search terms than it is to pay a person to make that book for you. I will say, my prompts were not perfect, and this book was a bit of a rush job. It took me 2 hours, and it's good, but it's not great. As you listen to me read it to you, I'm going to think about what implications this kind of generation could have. This was a proof of concept I made in 2 hours, but there are hundreds of gurus out there who probably think that this will be their best shot at a passive income. If they put their heads together, well, the kids of the future might not be reading books that were written by people. If you truly want to get a sense of how likely that is, I highly recommend you listen to this whole book. AI-generated works have strengths and they have weaknesses, and understanding those strengths and weaknesses will be so important as we enter this new phase of AI-generated content. Let's get started. Welcome, dear readers, to the exciting story of George Washington and the crossing of the Delaware River. Join us on a journey back in time to the birth of the United States and discover the courage and determination of one of our greatest heroes. Our story takes place on a cold December night in the year 1776. The Continental Army, led by General George Washington, is camped on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, while the British Army and their Hessian allies are on the New Jersey side. The war for independence has been going on for many months, and the Americans have suffered many defeats. But General Washington has a plan to turn the tide of the war, and it involves crossing the Delaware River. This is General George Washington, the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He is a great leader, a brave soldier, and a wise strategist. His troops love and respect him, and they trust him to lead them to victory. But the war is not going well, and many soldiers are starting to lose hope. It is up to General Washington to inspire and motivate his troops, and to come up with a plan to surprise the enemy. General Washington called his officers and explained the plan. They would cross the Delaware River during the night and attack the enemy camp by surprise. The plan was risky, but it had a chance of success. The officers agreed, and the soldiers started to prepare for the crossing. But some of them were still doubtful and afraid. 2 soldiers named Tom and Billy were especially worried. They'd never crossed a river before. They didn't like the idea of doing it in the middle of the night in the freezing cold. "I don't know about this," said Tom. "It's crazy," said Billy. But their friend, John, who had crossed many rivers before, tried to reassure them. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll be okay. We have a great leader, and we have each other." As the soldiers were preparing for the crossing, General Washington stood on a rock and addressed them. "Soldiers," he said, "I know this is a difficult mission, but we have no choice. Our cause is just, and we must fight for it. We are the defenders of freedom. We cannot let the enemy triumph. But we are not alone. We have the support of the American people who are counting on us to win the war. And we have each other, who will stand by each other no matter what. So let us cross this river, and let us win this battle." The soldiers were inspired by General Washington's words, and they felt a new sense of determination. The soldiers waded into the river, carrying their boats, paddles, and supplies. The water was freezing and the wind was howling, but they didn't give up. They pushed their boats through the ice floes, splashing and shivering. Some of them held torches to see where they were going, and some of them held their muskets above their head to keep them dry. The crossing was difficult and dangerous, but the soldiers were determined to succeed. They knew that the fate of their country depended on them. General Washington's speech was powerful and inspiring. He reminded his soldiers of the importance of their mission and the sacrifices they had made for their cause of freedom. "Soldiers," he said, "we are not just fighting for ourselves. We are fighting for our families, our friends, our fellow citizens. We are fighting for a new nation where all people are equal and free. We are fighting for the future of America, so let us not give up. Let us not lose hope. Let us believe in ourselves and our cause. We are the Continental Army, and we will win this war." The soldiers cheered and applauded, feeling more confident and motivated than ever before. The soldiers paddled their boats across the river, braving the freezing waters and the howling winds. The journey was perilous and exhausting. The wind and the waves pushed the boats back, and the soldiers had to row harder and harder. Some of them used poles to push the boats forward, and some of them had to jump into the river and push away the ice floes and rocks. The soldiers were wet and cold, their hands and feet were numb, but they didn't give up. They knew the enemy was waiting for them and that they had to reach the other side. Sarah and James were 2 soldiers who had never met before. They were both from different states. They had come from different backgrounds, but now they were rowing the same boat. They were fighting the same battle. They looked at each other and smiled, trying to encourage each other. "We can do this," said Sarah. "We'll get to the other side," said James. They rowed harder, and they didn't stop. They knew that they were not alone, and they knew they had each other's back. After crossing the river, George and his troops encountered many obstacles on the way to the enemy camp. They had to climb a steep hill, cross a frozen bridge, and navigate a deep ravine. The journey was perilous and exhausting, and the soldiers were tired and frustrated, but they didn't give up. They helped each other and kept moving forward, knowing that their mission was too important to fail. As the soldiers were walking through the woods, they heard a rustling sound. They stopped looking around, wondering if it was the enemy. But then they saw a young boy named Timmy coming towards them. Timmy looked scared at first, but then he smiled and offered to help. "I know a shortcut. he said. "It's a trail hidden that the enemy doesn't know about. You can use it to surprise them." The soldiers were surprised and grateful. They thanked Timmy and followed him, eager to reach the enemy camp. After many hours of walking and climbing, George and his troops finally approached the enemy camp. They could see the lights and the fires. They could hear the sounds of the soldiers talking and singing. They had to be careful not to be seen or heard. They hid behind trees and bushes, trying to be as quiet as possible. The moon was shining in the sky. The snow was crunching under their feet. The soldiers were nervous and excited, knowing that the fate of the war depended on them. At a signal, George and the soldiers launched a surprise attack on the enemy camp. They fired their muskets. They charged with bayonets. The British and Hessian soldiers were caught off guard, and they looked surprised and confused. They tried to defend themselves, but it was too late. The Continental Army was too strong and too determined. They fought with all their might, knowing that the future of their country depended on their success. After a fierce battle, the soldiers emerged victorious. They had won a great victory over the enemy and proven their courage and determination. They celebrated with hugs, cheers, musket salutes. George stood on a rock, looking proud and relieved. He thanked his soldiers and praised their bravery. The British and Hessian soldiers surrendered with their hands in the air. The Continental Army had won a great battle. They had taken a big step towards victory and in the war for independence. And this is where it seems like it ends, but it doesn't really end. As the soldiers looked around the enemy camp, they realized their intelligence was wrong. The enemy was stronger and better prepared than they thought. The British and Hessian soldiers were marching and drilling, looking confident and disciplined. They had more soldiers, more guns, more supplies. The soldiers looked at each other, worried and scared. They knew they were facing a difficult challenge, and they had to be smart and brave to win. George and his officers gathered around a table, looking at a map of the enemy camp. They knew they had to find a new strategy to defeat the enemy. They discussed different options, pointing at different locations and making different plans. They talked about the strengths and weaknesses of the enemy and about the strengths and weaknesses of their own army. They knew they had to be creative and flexible, and that they had to use all of their resources and skills. The soldiers were resting and repairing their weapons, waiting for the next phase of the battle. They looked at their leaders, hoping for a solution. George and his officers had found a new strategy to defeat the enemy. They planned a surprise attack on the British and Hessian soldiers using a diversionary tactic to confuse and mislead them. The soldiers were preparing for battle, putting on their hats and coats, checking their muskets and bayonets, and getting into formation. George gave them a rousing speech, reminding them of the importance of their mission and encouraging them to fight fiercely and bravely. The sky was cloudy and the air was tense and cold. The soldiers knew that they were facing a great challenge, but they were determined to win. At a signal from George, the soldiers charged into battle. They ran towards the enemy camp, firing their muskets and shouting their battle cries. George was leading them from the front with his sword in hand. The British and Hessian soldiers looked surprised and confused, trying to defend themselves. The soldiers fought fiercely and bravely, using all their skills and courage. Some of them used bayonets to fight in close combat, and some of them used hand-to-hand combat. The sky was dark, and the snow was falling heavily. The soldiers knew they were facing a great challenge, but they didn't give up. After a long and grueling battle, the soldiers emerged victorious. They had fought fiercely and bravely, and they had achieved a crucial victory in the Revolutionary War. The British and Hessian soldiers surrendered with their hands in the air. The soldiers were cheering, hugging, and waving their muskets in the air, celebrating their success. George was in the center, looking proud and relieved. He thanked his soldiers and praised their bravery. He knew that they had taken big steps towards winning the war for independence. The sky was clearing up, and the sun was shining through the clouds as if celebrating their victory with them. The soldiers knew they had done something great, and they felt proud and honored to serve their country. After the battle, the soldiers captured many enemy soldiers and supplies. They felt proud and accomplished knowing they had dealt a severe blow to the enemy. They celebrated their victory, cheering, laughing, and hugging each other. They held their muskets and the flags in their raiments, feeling proud and honored to serve their country. The sky was blue, the sun was shining brightly, as if congratulating them on their success. The soldiers felt a sense of camaraderie and brotherhood, knowing that they had fought together and won together. As George and his troops returned across the Delaware River, they faced new challenges and danger. The river was filled with ice floes, making it hard to navigate. The soldiers had to row the boats using all their strength and skill to avoid getting stuck or capsized. They were tired and cold, but they knew they had to keep going. They also knew the enemy might ambush them, trying to take revenge for their defeat. They had to be alert and prepared, using all of their training and experience. George was in the center, looking determined and focused, leading his troops with courage and vision. They had won a great battle, but they knew the war was far from over. George and his troops emerged victorious from their journey, having proved themselves as brave and capable soldiers. They had faced great challenges, they had overcome them with skill and courage, and they had won a great battle. And they had shown that they were a force to be reckoned with. The soldiers marched proudly with the American flag waving in the background. They looked confident, determined, and ready to face whatever lay ahead. They were wearing their uniforms, carrying their weapons, and singing patriotic songs, feeling proud and honored to serve their country. They knew they had done something great, and that they had made a difference in the world. And that's that. I hope you enjoyed the story, and I hope the AI isn't creeping you out too much. But if you're curious how this book came to be or what went into the prompt engineering that generated it, I highly recommend you watch the behind the scenes right here next. Yep, just click on my face. All right, I'll see you there.